Claire Thornton wiped down the counter at Murphy's Diner for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The small coastal town of Millhaven moved at its own pace, and that pace was deliberately slow. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, conversations drifted between tables about fishing conditions and weather patterns, and the morning regulars settled into their usual routines. At 52, Claire had found a rhythm in this simplicity. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands, steady and sure, moved efficiently between tasks. What the locals didn't know was that these same hands had once operated complex pressure systems 300 feet beneath the ocean's surface. The morning rush at Murphy's followed a predictable pattern. By 6:30, the fishing crews would arrive for coffee and breakfast sandwiches before heading to their boats. The construction workers came next, ordering hearty meals that would fuel them through long days of physical labor. Finally, the office workers would stop by around 8, grabbing quick coffee and pastries before driving to jobs in the larger towns along the coast. Claire knew them all by name now, understood their preferences, their stories, their small dramas and victories. There was something comforting about this predictability after years of military service, where every day could bring life-threatening emergencies at a moment's notice. "Claire, can you take table 6?" called Janet Murphy from behind the register. Janet was the owner's daughter, a kind woman in her 30s who had inherited more than just the diner from her father. She'd also inherited his ability to read people, to know when someone needed extra attention or space to think. "Of course," Claire replied, grabbing the coffee pot and heading toward the booth by the window. The customer was new to town, a middle-aged man in a business suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the casual atmosphere of Murphy's. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, suggesting travel and stress. He ordered black coffee and toast, barely glancing up from his phone, which buzzed constantly with messages he seemed reluctant to answer. As Claire poured the coffee, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The tremor was subtle, but after years of monitoring crew members for signs of pressure sickness and stress, she'd learned to read physical symptoms that others missed. The way he held his shoulders, the tension around his eyes, the careful way he breathed, all signs of someone dealing with significant pressure. "First time in Millhaven?" she asked quietly. He looked up, surprised by the question. His eyes were bloodshot, suggesting sleep deprivation, and there was something haunted in his expression. "Is it that obvious?" "The town has a way of announcing itself to newcomers. You either love it or you can't wait to leave." He managed a weak smile. "I'm hoping to love it. I'm David Fletcher, by the way. Just bought the old Henderson place on Maple Street." Claire nodded. Everyone in town knew the Henderson house, a beautiful Victorian that had sat empty for 3 years after old Mrs. Henderson passed away. The house was a local landmark, with its wraparound porch and elaborate gingerbread trim, but it needed extensive work. "Welcome to Millhaven, David. I'm Claire. What brings you to our little corner of the world?" David's expression darkened slightly, and he glanced around the diner as if checking to see who might be listening. "Career change. Sometimes you need to start over completely, you know?" Claire understood better than he could possibly imagine. Sometimes starting over is the only way forward. She left him with his coffee and toast, but something about his demeanor stayed with her. The way he kept glancing at his phone, the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he spoke. It reminded her of submariners dealing with classified information, always watching what they said and to whom. But there was something else, a particular kind of defeat that she recognized from her own mirror during the first months after her discharge. The morning crowd began to thin out around 10:30. Claire was refilling the sugar dispensers when old Pete Harrison shuffled in, wearing his usual flannel shirt and work boots despite being retired for 15 years. Pete had been a commercial fisherman before arthritis forced him to give up the nets, and he still maintained the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades battling the ocean. "Morning, Claire," Pete said, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. "Coffee, black, and whatever Janet's got that's closest to edible." Claire smiled and poured his coffee. Pete's gruff exterior hid a sharp intelligence and decades of experience reading weather patterns from the water. If anyone in town understood the moods of the sea and sky, it was Pete. "You feeling that change in the air, Pete?" Claire asked, noting the way the old fisherman kept glancing toward the windows. "Been feeling it for 2 days," Pete replied, accepting a plate of fresh blueberry muffins. "Barometric pressure's dropping fast, winds shifting to the southeast. And look at them birds." Claire followed his gaze to see gulls flying inland in large numbers, their usual coastal patterns disrupted by instincts older than human weather prediction. "Storm coming?" she asked. "More than a storm, I think. Been watching weather for 40 years, and this feels different. Heavier, like the whole ocean's getting ready to move somewhere it doesn't belong." Before Claire could respond, the weather radio in the kitchen crackled to life with an urgent announcement. "This is the National Weather Service with an emergency weather alert for coastal regions. A severe storm system is approaching from the southeast. Rainfall amounts of 8 to 12 inches are expected over the next 18 hours, with winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour. Flash flood warnings are in effect for all low-lying areas." Janet emerged from the kitchen, her face pale. "Claire, did you hear that?" "I heard it." Claire was already moving toward the window, studying the sky with eyes trained by years of reading weather patterns from beneath the ocean's surface. In the distance, she could see dark clouds building on the horizon, their edges lit with the kind of electric energy that preceded serious weather. The morning's gentle breeze had picked up, carrying the smell of rain and something else. The electric tension that preceded serious weather. Pete Harrison stood up from his stool, leaving money on the counter. "Claire, you mind some advice from an old salt?" "Always." "Whatever that radio's saying about 8 to 12 inches of rain, double it. The ocean's angry today, and when she gets angry, she doesn't hold back." "We've had bad storms before," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. Claire had spent 15 years reading weather patterns from beneath the ocean, watching how surface conditions affected underwater operations. She understood the relationship between atmospheric pressure, water movement, and the complex systems that could turn routine weather into catastrophic events. What she saw building wasn't just a bad storm, it was potentially catastrophic for a town like Millhaven. The town sat in what geologists called a natural catchment basin, a valley between two hills that naturally collected and channeled water. In normal conditions, this geography created the picturesque setting that made Millhaven attractive to tourists and new residents. But in extreme weather, the same topography that made the town beautiful could make it deadly. "Janet, when was the last time the town's drainage system was inspected?" "I don't know. Why would you ask something like that?" Claire was already reaching for her jacket, her mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had kept submarines and their crews safe for over a decade. Because this town sits in a natural basin, and if the storm drains can't handle this much water, we're going to have serious problems. She left the diner and walked quickly toward the town hall, her stride lengthening as urgency built in her chest. Millhaven had been built in the 1940s, nestled in a valley between two hills, with Mill Creek running through it like a silver thread. Beautiful in good weather, but potentially dangerous if the water had nowhere to go. The streets showed early signs of the approaching storm. Leaves swirled in small tornadoes, shop owners were securing outdoor displays, and the harbor showed the peculiar choppiness that preceded heavy weather. But most people went about their morning routines, trusting that storms were temporary inconveniences rather than genuine threats. The town hall was a modest brick building that housed the mayor's office, the town clerk, and the small police station. Built in 1952, it had weathered dozens of storms, but Claire noted the way water stains on the basement windows suggested past flooding issues that might not be in any official records. She found Mayor Patricia Williams in her office, staring at the same weather reports on a computer screen that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. Patricia was in her 60s, a retired teacher who had taken the mayor's job more out of civic duty than political ambition. Her desk was neat but showed signs of stress: empty coffee cups, scattered papers, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested someone trying to manage too many responsibilities with too few resources. "Mayor Williams? I'm Clare Thornton. I work at Murphy's Diner." The mayor looked up with tired eyes that suggested she'd been dealing with storm preparations since dawn. "Hello, Claire. If you're here about the storm, I'm afraid there's not much we can do except wait it out. With respect, Mayor, I think there might be more we can do. I have some experience with water management systems, and I'm concerned about the town's ability to handle this much rainfall." Patricia studied Claire with new interest, noting something in her bearing that didn't match the casual demeanor of a diner waitress. "What kind of experience?" Claire hesitated. She'd spent 5 years in Millhaven without discussing her past with anyone. The comfortable anonymity of being just another waitress had been exactly what she needed after the accident that ended her naval career. But sometimes the past demanded to be useful. "I served 15 years in the Navy, specializing in submarine water and pressure systems. I understand how water behaves under different conditions, and I'm worried about what happens when this storm hits." The mayor's eyebrows rose. "You were on submarines?" "Engineering specialist. I know how to read water patterns, drainage systems, pressure differentials, and right now, everything I'm seeing tells me this town is about to face more water than it can handle." Patricia leaned back in her chair, reassessing the woman she'd known only as a friendly face from the diner. "Claire, I have to ask, if you have that kind of background, why are you waiting tables?" "Because sometimes people need to disappear for a while," Claire replied honestly. "But right now, that experience might be the only thing standing between this town and a disaster." Before the mayor could respond, the office door burst open. Tom Bradley, the town's volunteer fire chief, rushed in with rain already dripping from his jacket. Tom was a big man in his 50s, a retired construction foreman who'd moved to Millhaven for the quiet life, and found himself responsible for emergency services through a combination of competence and bad timing. "Patricia, we've got problems. The Weather Service just upgraded their forecast. We're looking at 14 to 16 inches of rain, and Mill Creek is already rising. Plus, I just heard from the county. The Riverside Dam, about 20 miles upstream, has some structural concerns." Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Riverside Dam was a 1960s construction project that provided flood control for the entire river valley. If the dam had structural issues during a major storm event, the consequences would cascade through every community downstream. "What kind of structural concerns?" she asked. Tom looked at her with confusion. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Clare Thornton. I was just explaining to the mayor that I have experience with water management systems." "The dam's spillway has been compromised," Tom continued, addressing both women. "Nothing immediate, but if we get the amount of rain they're predicting, they might have to open the floodgates to prevent total dam failure." "How much warning would we get?" Claire asked, her mind already calculating water volumes and flow rates. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky." Claire closed her eyes, running calculations in her head. Volume of water, drainage capacity, topography, time factors. She visualized Millhaven from above, seeing it as a submarine commander would see an underwater terrain, identifying choke points, pressure differentials, and potential failure modes. The math was unforgiving. Mayor Williams, Chief Bradley, I need to ask some specific questions, and I need honest answers. How old is the town's storm drain system? Original construction was 1947, Patricia replied. Some updates in the 70s, but nothing major. What's the total drainage capacity for the downtown area? Tom and Patricia exchanged glances. I'm not sure anyone knows that, Tom admitted. The records from the original construction are probably in storage somewhere, but we've never had to calculate total capacity. We need to find out, and we need to find out now. Do you have the original municipal plans? They should be in the archives, Patricia said. But Claire, even if we know the capacity, what can we do about it? Claire was already moving toward the door, her mind shifting into the emergency management mode that had been dormant for 5 years. We improvise. Chief Bradley, how many people do you have available for emergency operations? The volunteer fire department has 12 active members, though 2 are out of town. The police department has 4 officers, including Chief Morrison. Not enough. Claire paused at the door, making a decision that would change her carefully quiet life forever. Mayor Williams, I need you to authorize me to coordinate emergency water management for this storm. I know that sounds presumptuous, but I also know that without proper preparation, people are going to die tonight. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows, with increasing intensity. Patricia Williams studied Claire's face, seeing something there that she hadn't noticed in 5 years of casual diner conversations, the kind of contained intensity that marked people accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. What do you need? The mayor asked quietly. Access to the municipal archives, authority to organize volunteer teams, and permission to implement emergency measures that might seem unusual. Done. Chief Bradley, you'll coordinate with Clare on all emergency response. Tom looked skeptical. Patricia, with all due respect, we don't know anything about her qualifications beyond her word. Clare turned back to face him, and for a moment, her carefully maintained civilian demeanor slipped, revealing something harder underneath. Chief Bradley, in 15 years of submarine service, I never lost a crew member to water-related emergencies. I understand pressure systems, water flow dynamics, and emergency response under extreme conditions. Right now, that experience might be the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the first real drops of rain were beginning to fall. Claire checked her watch. 11:47 a.m. If the weather service was right, they had maybe 6 hours before the worst of the storm hit. We need to move now, she said. Every minute we wait makes this harder. As they headed toward the archives in the basement of the town hall, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with responsibility for other people's lives. She'd thought that part of her career was over, finished by the accident that had cost 3 lives and her naval commission. But sometimes experience demanded to be used, regardless of the circumstances that ended it. The town hall's basement smelled of old paper and forgotten bureaucracy, with the added mustiness that suggested previous water damage. Claire spread the municipal planning documents across a folding table, while Mayor Williams held a flashlight to supplement the dim overhead bulb. The drawings were yellowed with age but still legible, showing the original drainage system designed for a much smaller town dealing with different weather patterns. The main storm drain runs along Mill Street, Claire said, tracing the lines with her finger while making quick calculations on a scratch pad. It's designed to handle about 4 inches of rain per hour, assuming normal soil absorption and minimal runoff from impervious surfaces. Chief Bradley leaned over her shoulder, studying the technical drawings with the practical eye of someone who'd spent years in construction. And we're expecting potentially 4 times that amount, with saturated soil that won't absorb anything, and runoff from 2 hills that will channel everything into the downtown area. Claire looked up from the maps, her expression grim. Chief, where does this main drain empty? Into Mill Creek, about half a mile downstream from downtown. Claire found the creek on the topographical map and felt her stomach sink. Mill Creek's path through town followed the natural geography, but that same natural flow would become a highway for disaster if the water had nowhere else to go. The creek runs directly past the elementary school and the senior center before it reaches the river. That's right. Why? Because if the drain system backs up, which it will, the overflow is going to follow the path of least resistance. That means flooding in the lowest areas first. She pointed to the map, her finger tracing the potential flood zones. Main Street, the school, the senior center, and about 30 homes in the Valley View neighborhood. The Valley View neighborhood was Millhaven's most affordable housing area, home to young families, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and service workers who kept the town running. The houses were older, many without basements, and most residents lacked the resources to quickly evacuate or recover from flood damage. Mayor Williams paled. How many people are we talking about? The elementary school has classes until 3:30. That's about 200 children and staff. The senior center usually has 40 to 50 residents during day programs. Valley View has maybe 80 families. We need to evacuate, Chief Bradley said immediately. Evacuate where? Claire countered. The county emergency shelter is 20 miles away on roads that will be flooded. The high school could work for temporary shelter, but we'd need to transport 300 people in vehicles that might not be able to navigate flood conditions. So, what do you suggest? Claire was already rolling up the municipal plans, her mind working through options with the systematic approach that submarine emergencies had taught her. We don't fight it, we redirect it. But first, I need to see the actual infrastructure. Chief, can you get me access to the main storm drain junction? 30 minutes later, Claire was climbing down into a concrete tunnel that ran beneath Mill Street, wearing borrowed coveralls and carrying a flashlight that Chief Bradley had pulled from his emergency kit. The storm drain was larger than she'd expected, but not nearly large enough for what was coming. The concrete walls showed water stains from previous floods, and she could see where decades of debris had created choke points that would restrict flow during heavy rainfall. She played her flashlight along the walls, noting crack patterns, debris buildup, and most importantly, the junction points, where smaller drains fed into the main system. Each junction represented a potential failure point, where backing water could find alternative routes, potentially into basements, businesses, and homes. Above ground, she could hear the rain intensity increasing, drumming against the metal storm drain covers with growing urgency. When she climbed back up, her jacket was soaked just from the few minutes outdoors, and the wind had picked up enough to make standing difficult. The good news is, the main drain is structurally sound, she reported to the group that had gathered around the manhole cover. The bad news is, there are at least 6 junction points that are partially blocked by debris and sediment buildup. Under normal conditions, that's not a problem. Under the conditions we're expecting, those blockages will create backups that flood the entire downtown area. Tom Bradley shook his head. Claire, even if we could clear those junctions, which would take days with proper equipment, it's still not enough capacity. You're right. That's why we're going to create additional capacity. Claire pulled out a small notebook and began sketching, her engineering training translating abstract hydraulic principles into concrete action plans. We need to dig relief channels at 3 key points to redirect overflow away from the critical areas. Dig channels? In the middle of a storm? Before the storm gets worse. We've got maybe 4 hours of moderate rain before the heavy stuff hits. That's our window. By now, Word of the emergency preparations was spreading through Millhaven's informal communication networks. The town was small enough that unusual activity was quickly noticed and discussed. People began gathering around the town hall, some out of curiosity, others offering to help. Mayor Williams looked at the growing crowd of city workers and volunteers, noting faces she'd known for years: shop owners, teachers, retirees, high school students home for lunch. Claire, what exactly are you proposing? Controlled flooding. We identify areas where we can safely divert overflow: the town park, the empty lot behind the hardware store, the parking area near the marina. We dig shallow channels to guide water to those areas instead of letting it find its own path through our homes and businesses. That could work, said a voice from behind the group. Everyone turned to see David Fletcher, the newcomer from the diner, approaching with a large umbrella and a determined expression that looked different from his morning defeat. I'm a civil engineer. Well, was a civil engineer. What you're describing is basically temporary flood control. Claire studied him with new interest, noting how his posture had changed from defeated to engaged. What kind of civil engineering? Water management systems for urban areas. I specialized in flood control and drainage infrastructure. He looked embarrassed but determined. Before I decided to run away to a small town and pretend my career never happened. David, Claire said firmly, today is not the day for running away. We need your expertise. The transformation was immediate. David Fletcher straightened, his professional instincts overriding his personal crisis. If we're going to do this, we need to calculate volumes carefully. Divert too much water to an area that can't handle it, and we just move the problem instead of solving it. For the next hour, Claire found herself at the center of the largest emergency mobilization in Millhaven's recent history. David Fletcher's engineering knowledge combined with her understanding of emergency management to create a plan that was both ambitious and achievable. They divided the town into zones based on elevation and drainage patterns. Each zone would have specific relief channels designed to redirect overflow to designated collection areas. The channels would be shallow, but strategically placed to intercept water before it could reach critical infrastructure. The key, Claire explained to the growing group of volunteers, is that we're not trying to stop the water. We're trying to control where it goes. Word had spread through the town's informal networks with the speed that only small communities could achieve. The hardware store donated shovels, tarps, and sandbags. The local construction company, recognizing the emergency, provided a small excavator and 2 dump trucks operated by volunteers who knew how to use them. The high school principal, responding to phone calls from concerned parents, dismissed classes early and sent the football team to help with emergency preparations. Claire organized the volunteers into teams, assigning each group to specific locations based on the topographical analysis she and David had completed. Team leaders received hand-drawn maps showing exactly where to dig relief channels and how deep to go. Sarah Martinez, who ran the local bakery, raised her hand during the briefing. Claire, how do you know this is going to work? The question hung in the air, and Claire realized that everyone was looking at her with a mixture of trust and uncertainty. These people were putting their faith in someone they knew only as a diner waitress, asking them to undertake major construction work based on her say-so. Because, Claire said slowly, choosing her words carefully, I've spent 15 years managing water systems in environments where a mistake could kill everyone around me. I understand how water behaves, how pressure builds, and how to redirect dangerous flow. This isn't exactly the same as submarine operations, but the principles are identical. She gestured toward the darkening sky, where clouds were building with ominous speed. In about 3 hours, this town is going to be hit with more water than its infrastructure can handle. We can wait and hope for the best, or we can take control of the situation. I'd rather be working than waiting." The first team headed out to the town park, shovels over their shoulders like soldiers heading to battle. Claire watched them go, then turned to David Fletcher, who was reviewing elevation maps with the focused intensity of someone rediscovering purpose. "How are you holding up, engineer?" He managed a rueful smile, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him. "Better than I have in months, actually. It feels good to be useful again." "What made you leave engineering?" David's expression darkened, but he didn't look away. "I designed a flood control system for a small city in Colorado. Everything looked perfect on paper. Drainage calculations, soil absorption rates, emergency overflow protocols. But I missed something, a soil composition issue that should have been caught during the initial survey. When the big storm hit 2 years ago, the system failed catastrophically. 3 people died in the flooding that followed." Claire understood the weight he was carrying, the way professional failure could destroy not just careers but entire identities. "And now you're here. Now I'm here, trying to pretend that failure doesn't define me." "David," Claire said quietly, "today you get to prove that it doesn't." By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the rain was falling steadily, and the relief channels were taking shape across Millhaven. Claire moved between work sites, checking progress and making adjustments, her radio crackling with updates from team leaders who had embraced their unexpected roles as emergency coordinators. The football team had excavated an impressive channel system in the town park, their youthful energy and competitive spirit translating perfectly to the urgent physical work. The construction workers had used their equipment to create a major diversion route from Mill Street to the empty lot behind the hardware store, carving a path that would handle significant water flow. Most importantly, David Fletcher had organized a team to clear debris from the main storm drain junctions, crawling through concrete tunnels in increasingly difficult conditions to remove years of accumulated sediment that would have created dangerous backups. Claire was checking the channel at the senior center when her radio crackled with Tom Bradley's voice, tight with concern. "Claire, come in." "I'm here, Chief. We just got word from the county. The Riverside Dam is showing more stress than they anticipated. They're talking about opening the floodgates earlier than expected." Claire felt ice form in her stomach. The dam release would add thousands of cubic feet per second to Mill Creek's flow, overwhelming their carefully planned drainage improvements. How much earlier? Maybe within the hour. She looked at her watch. 2:15 p.m. The additional water from the dam would arrive just as the storm reached its peak intensity, creating a compound emergency that would test every preparation they'd made. "Chief, we need to accelerate everything. Get on the radio and tell all teams to finish their current sections and move to Phase 2 positions immediately." "What's Phase 2? Claire realized she hadn't told anyone about Phase 2 because she'd hoped it wouldn't be necessary. "Sandbagging critical buildings and creating elevated walkways for emergency evacuation." She keyed the radio again, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years of emergency command experience. "All team leaders, this is Claire. We've moved to emergency status. Complete your current work and report to the town hall for new assignments. We're running out of time." As volunteers began streaming back toward the center of town, their clothes muddy and their faces showing the strain of hard physical work, Claire allowed herself one moment of doubt. She'd convinced an entire town to undertake massive earthworks based on her calculations and experience. If she was wrong, if her understanding of the local conditions was flawed, people could die because they trusted her judgment. But there was no time for doubt. The radio crackled again with reports from the Weather Service. The storm was intensifying faster than predicted, and the dam operators were preparing for emergency release procedures that hadn't been used since the dam's construction. Claire looked up at the darkening sky, noting how the clouds had taken on the greenish tinge that often preceded severe weather events, and made a decision that would determine whether her submarine training could translate to saving lives on dry land. Phase 2, she said into her radio, her voice carrying across the town with the confidence that had once kept submarines safe in the deepest waters. Everyone moves to Phase 2 right now. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Millhaven looked like a town preparing for siege. Sandbags lined the entrances to critical buildings in neat, professional rows that spoke to military precision. Relief channels carved temporary scars through parks and parking lots, their raw earth dark with increasing rainfall. Elevated walkways made from construction planks connected key locations, creating escape routes above potential flood levels. Claire stood on the steps of the town hall, rain streaming down her face, coordinating final preparations through her handheld radio. The transformation in her bearing was complete. Gone was the quiet waitress who'd served coffee that morning, replaced by someone who moved with the controlled urgency of emergency command. The elementary school had been evacuated ahead of schedule, with children and staff moved to the high school on higher ground. The operation had gone smoothly, organized by teachers who'd embraced the unusual circumstances with the adaptability that made small-town communities resilient. School buses had navigated increasingly difficult roads to transport students to safety, their drivers using local knowledge to avoid areas where flooding was already beginning. The senior center residents were relocated to the second floor of the community center, where volunteers had created a comfortable temporary shelter with cots, medical supplies, and activities to keep elderly residents calm during what was likely to be a frightening night. Nurse Helen Morris, who ran the senior center's medical program, had organized medications and emergency medical equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with crises before. Team 3, what's your status on the Mill Street diversion? Claire called into the radio, watching water levels rise in the carefully constructed channels. Channel is complete, and water is already flowing through it, came David Fletcher's voice, steady and professional. The main storm drain is backing up just like you predicted, but our relief system is handling the overflow. So far? Good. Team 5, how are the sandbags holding at the pharmacy? Solid. Water's rising, but staying below the barriers. We've got volunteers standing by with additional bags if needed. Claire allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Maybe they'd done enough. Maybe her calculations had been correct, and their improvised flood control system would be sufficient to handle whatever the storm delivered. Then Tom Bradley's voice cut through on the emergency frequency, carrying news that would change everything. All units. County Emergency Management reports that Riverside Dam is releasing floodwaters immediately. Repeat, immediate release authorized. Estimated time of arrival in Millhaven is 45 minutes. Water level is expected to be 4 to 6 feet above normal creek height. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. 4 to 6 feet above normal meant their relief channels, designed for gradual overflow, would be completely overwhelmed. The carefully controlled flooding they'd planned was about to become a real emergency that would test every skill she'd learned in 15 years of submarine service. She keyed her radio, her voice carrying the calm authority that submarine emergencies had taught her. All team leaders, report to Town Hall immediately. We're implementing final emergency protocols. As the volunteers gathered around her, Claire could see fear beginning to replace the determination that had carried them through the afternoon's preparations. These weren't trained emergency responders. They were shop owners, teachers, retirees, and teenagers who had trusted her leadership. Now, she had to ask them to face something that was potentially life-threatening. The situation has changed, she announced, raising her voice to carry over the increasing wind and rain. The dam release means we're going to get hit with more water than we prepared for. Our flood control measures will help, but they won't be enough to prevent significant flooding in the downtown area. What do we do? Asked Sarah Martinez, her bakery apron still dusted with flour from the morning that now seemed like a different world. Claire pulled out her notebook, pages now soggy with rain but still readable. We shift to search and rescue operations. I need teams positioned at every location where people might be trapped by rising water. Primary concern is anyone who might not have heard the evacuation notices or who couldn't leave their homes. She pointed to different groups, organizing them with the systematic approach that submarine emergency drills had taught her. Team 1, take the Valley View neighborhood. Go door to door. Make sure everyone is accounted for. Team 2, check all the businesses on Main Street. Some shop owners might have stayed behind to protect their inventory. Team 3, sweep the area around Mill Creek for anyone who might be stranded. David Fletcher stepped forward, his earlier hesitation replaced by professional focus. Claire, what about the drainage system? If the main storm drain backs up completely, we could have sewage mixing with floodwater. That creates health hazards on top of the immediate danger. Already thought of that. Chief Bradley, I need your people to shut off water to the downtown area at the main junction. We can't prevent contamination, but we can minimize it. Tom nodded grimly, understanding the implications. I'll get on it. Everyone else, Claire continued, remember that moving water is incredibly dangerous. 6 inches of flowing water can knock you down. 18 inches can carry away a car. If you encounter anyone trapped by floodwater, radio for help immediately. Don't attempt solo rescues unless you have specific water rescue training. As the teams dispersed into the storm, their reflective vests disappearing into sheets of rain that made visibility difficult beyond a few yards, Claire found herself alone with Mayor Williams and a small group of essential personnel. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the wind was strong enough to make walking difficult. Claire, Patricia Williams said, having to raise her voice to be heard over the storm, I need to ask, are you sure about these evacuation procedures? Some people are questioning whether we needed to go this far. It was a fair question that Claire had been expecting. Emergency management was always a balance between overreaction and under-preparation, between causing unnecessary panic and failing to provide adequate warning. She'd made decisions that disrupted the entire town based on her interpretation of weather data and infrastructure limitations. If she was wrong, she'd be remembered as the waitress who panicked an entire community over a bad storm. Mayor, in my experience, it's better to be wrong about being cautious than to be wrong about being optimistic. If we over-prepared, people will be annoyed and will have some cleanup work. If we under-prepared, people will die. Before Patricia could respond, David Fletcher's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled urgency. Claire, come in immediately. I'm here, David. We've got a major problem at Mill Creek. The water's rising faster than expected, and there are 3 people trapped on the roof of the old Miller house. It's the White House about a quarter-mile downstream from the Main Street Bridge. Claire knew the house. Frank and Dorothy Miller, an elderly couple in their 80s who had lived there for 40 years, were probably among the most vulnerable residents in town. They were known for their independence and their reluctance to accept help, which meant they'd likely refused evacuation orders. How trapped are they? She asked, already moving toward the marina where emergency boats were stored. Water's about 3 feet deep around the house and rising fast. They can't wade out, and we can't get a vehicle close enough to reach them. The current's getting stronger by the minute. Claire closed her eyes, running through options with the systematic approach that submarine emergencies had drilled into her. The Miller house was in a low-lying area that would be completely flooded when the dam release water arrived. Standard rescue procedure would be to wait for specialized water rescue equipment from the county, but that would take at least an hour, time they didn't have. David, can you see any way to reach them on foot? Negative. The current's too strong and there's debris in the water, tree branches, lawn furniture, parts of someone's deck. We need a boat. Are there any boats in town? Tom Bradley, monitoring the radio conversation, spoke up. The marina has some small boats, but they're not designed for flood rescue. Too dangerous to operate in this kind of current with an inexperienced crew. Claire looked at her watch. 4:37 p.m. The dam release water would reach Millhaven in less than 10 minutes. After that, the Miller house would be underwater, and any rescue would become a body recovery operation. I'm going to get them, she said simply. Claire, no, Mayor Williams protested. We can't risk losing you too. You're coordinating everything. Patricia, those people are going to die if someone doesn't act right now. And I'm the only person here with experience in underwater rescue operations. She was already moving toward the marina, her mind shifting into the operational mode that had kept submarines safe for 15 years. Water rescue in flood conditions wasn't the same as submarine emergency procedures, but the principles were similar. Understand the environment, minimize risk, execute with precision. The marina was partially flooded, with small boats bobbing against their docks like corks in a bathtub. Claire chose a 12-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard motor, stable, maneuverable, and light enough to handle in heavy current. As she prepared to launch the boat, checking the motor and fuel levels with automatic precision, David Fletcher appeared beside her, soaked to the skin but determined. I'm coming with you, he said. David, this isn't your job. Maybe not, but I know those people. Frank Miller was my first customer when I moved to town. He spent 2 hours helping me figure out what repairs the house needed. Wouldn't take any payment for his time. David's jaw was set with determination. Besides, you're going to need someone to handle the boat while you get them into it. Claire studied his face and saw something she recognized, the look of someone who needed to prove that past failures didn't define them. Can you handle an outboard motor? I grew up on lakes in Minnesota. I can handle the boat. They launched into water that was already 2 feet deep in the marina parking lot. The current was stronger than Claire had expected, and debris, tree branches, lawn furniture, pieces of buildings, created a dangerous obstacle course that required constant vigilance. Stay close to the shore where the current's weaker, Claire shouted over the sound of the motor and rain. Watch for power lines. David navigated skillfully, using eddies and back currents to make progress downstream. They could see the Miller house ahead, a small white structure that was now almost completely surrounded by dark, churning water. On the roof, 3 figures huddled together, Frank and Dorothy Miller, and a third person Claire couldn't identify from this distance. There, David pointed. But Claire looked downstream. Claire looked and felt her heart sink. A wall of water, muddy and filled with debris, was moving toward them from the direction of the dam. The flood release had reached the creek system, turning what had been a manageable rescue into a race against time. They had maybe 5 minutes before the additional water turned their rescue operation into a death sentence for everyone involved. Can you get us alongside the house? Claire asked. I'll try. David pushed the motor to full power, fighting the current and dodging floating obstacles with the skill of someone who'd learned to read water conditions as a child. As they approached the house, Claire could see the terror on the Millers' faces. The third person was their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who must have come to help with the evacuation and gotten trapped when the water rose faster than expected. Frank! Claire shouted as they came within voice range. We're going to throw you a rope. Tie it around Dorothy first, then Mrs. Peterson, then yourself. I can't swim, Dorothy called back, her voice barely audible over the storm. You don't have to swim. We're going to pull you to the boat. What happened next tested every skill Claire had learned in 15 years of emergency operations. David held the boat steady against the current, while Claire threw a rope to the roof. Frank Miller, despite his age and the difficult conditions, managed to secure it around his wife with hands that shook from cold and fear. Dorothy Miller's rescue was a lesson in controlled terror. The elderly woman, wearing a pink bathrobe over her clothes, had to lower herself into water that was over her head and trust that strangers would pull her to safety. Claire guided her to the boat while David fought to maintain position against increasingly strong current. Mrs. Peterson was next, younger and more agile but clearly panicked. She slipped getting into the water and went under for a terrifying moment before Claire could grab her and guide her to the boat's side. Frank Miller was the most difficult. The elderly man was clearly exhausted from helping the others, and by the time they were ready for him, the advancing floodwater was creating dangerous turbulence around the house. "Frank, you have to come now," Claire shouted. "We can't wait any longer." But as Frank lowered himself from the roof, the rope slipped from his tired hands. He fell into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. Claire didn't hesitate. She dove after him. The floodwater was shockingly cold and completely opaque with mud and debris. Claire felt around blindly, using the underwater search techniques she'd learned in submarine rescue training. Her lungs burned, but she forced herself to stay calm, to search systematically rather than panic. Her hand touched fabric, Frank's shirt. She grabbed hold and pulled him toward the surface, kicking hard against the current that was trying to sweep them both downstream toward the approaching wall of dam release water. They broke the surface together, Frank gasping and coughing. David had maneuvered the boat as close as he dared, and together they managed to get the elderly man aboard. "Go!" Claire shouted as she climbed back into the boat. "The big water's almost here!" David opened the throttle and began the desperate race back upstream. Behind them, the wall of dam release water swept over the Miller house, completely submerging the roof where 3 people had been standing just minutes before. They made it to the marina as the flood surge reached the downtown area. Main Street disappeared under 4 feet of muddy water, but their relief channels were working. Most of the flood was being diverted into the designated collection areas rather than backing up through the business district. The Miller family and Mrs. Peterson were transferred to the emergency medical team that had been standing by at the community center. All 3 would recover completely from their ordeal, but it had been close. Closer than Claire wanted to think about. As she stood in the parking lot behind Town Hall, watching floodwater swirl through carefully planned channels, Claire realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. For 5 years, she'd been running from the responsibility that came with specialized knowledge. Today, she'd remembered why that knowledge existed in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but for moments when ordinary people needed someone who understood how to keep them safe. The storm was far from over, but Millhaven had survived its worst hour. Throughout the night, Claire coordinated rescue operations from the emergency command center they'd established in the town hall. Teams with boats and high-clearance vehicles checked on stranded residents, delivered supplies to evacuation centers, and maintained communication with county emergency services. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and Mill Creek was returning to its banks. The relief channels Claire and David had designed were working exactly as planned, draining the temporary lakes that had formed in designated collection areas while keeping floodwater away from homes and critical infrastructure. Dawn came gray and subdued, filtering through clouds that still threatened more rain. Claire stood on the steps of the town hall, surveying the aftermath of what the Weather Service would later call a 100-year flood event. The transformation in the landscape was dramatic. What had been dry land 24 hours earlier now showed clear signs of high watermarks, debris lines, and the raw earth of hastily constructed emergency channels. But the most remarkable thing was what hadn't happened. No deaths, no serious injuries, minimal property damage to homes and businesses. The elementary school was undamaged. The senior center had stayed completely dry. The Valley View neighborhood had experienced minor flooding, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up with shop vacuums and fans. Claire. Mayor Williams approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the emergency operations center that had been set up in the town hall. She looked exhausted but relieved, wearing the same clothes from yesterday and carrying herself with the weight of someone who'd just lived through their first major emergency as a local official. "The State Emergency Management Director wants to speak with you," Patricia said, handing over one of the coffee cups. Claire accepted the coffee gratefully. She'd been awake for 26 hours straight, coordinating rescue operations and damage assessment, running on adrenaline and muscle memory from years of submarine emergency drills. What does he want to know? How a town of 3,000 people managed to survive a major flood event with 0 casualties and minimal property damage, especially when 3 other communities in the region weren't so lucky. Claire sipped her coffee, looking out at the evidence of their collective effort. "We got ahead of it instead of reacting to it. We used local knowledge and improvised solutions instead of waiting for official help that might not come in time." Patricia Williams sat down on the steps beside her, both women taking a moment to process what they'd accomplished. "Claire, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Would you consider staying in Millhaven permanently? Not as a waitress, but as our emergency management coordinator?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, watching David Fletcher organize a crew of volunteers who were clearing debris from the storm drains. He'd found his purpose again in the crisis, remembering that engineering disasters didn't have to define an engineer's entire career. "I've been running from responsibility for 5 years," Claire said finally. "After the accident that ended my naval career, I convinced myself that I was too dangerous to trust with other people's safety." What happened? Claire had never told the full story to anyone in Millhaven, but Patricia Williams had earned the right to hear it. Equipment failure during a deep water rescue operation. 3 crew members died because a pressure system I'd certified as safe malfunctioned during a critical moment. The investigation cleared me of fault. They determined it was a manufacturing defect that couldn't have been predicted. But I knew I'd missed something. Some small detail that could have prevented their deaths. Patricia was quiet, understanding that some confessions required silence to be heard properly. "Yesterday," Claire continued, "I realized that running from responsibility doesn't honor the people who died. Using what I learned from their deaths to prevent other deaths, that honors them. Is that a yes?" Claire smiled, the expression transforming her tired features. "That's a yes, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, we do this right. Real emergency preparedness training for the entire town, not just crisis response. We teach people how to recognize danger signs, how to prepare their families, how to help their neighbors." "Agreed." "Second, we establish mutual aid agreements with surrounding communities so we can help each other. Yesterday proved that emergencies don't respect town boundaries." "That makes sense." "Third, we create youth programs that teach basic emergency skills to teenagers. The kids who helped with the flood response showed that young people are incredibly capable when they're given real responsibility." Patricia stood up, brushing debris from her jacket. "Consider it done. The town council will meet this afternoon to make your appointment official, but I can tell you right now that you'll have unanimous support." As Patricia headed back into the town hall, Claire noticed someone approaching from across the parking lot. It was Frank Miller, walking slowly but steadily, wearing clean clothes donated by the Red Cross volunteers and carrying a small wrapped package. "Mr. Miller," Claire said, standing up, "how are you feeling?" "Like I've been swimming in a washing machine," Frank replied with a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." He held out the wrapped package. "Dorothy wanted you to have this. It's not much, but it's something she made years ago that survived the flood. Claire unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a small wooden plaque with hand-painted letters that read, "Home is where people care about each other." Mr. Miller, I can't accept this. Can't accept? You saved our lives, Claire. The least we can do is give you something to remember us by. Frank's eyes grew serious. But more than that, you gave this whole town something to be proud of. We worked together yesterday like I've never seen before. People who barely spoke to each other were digging channels side by side. Claire looked around at the evidence of their collective effort. The relief channels, the sandbag barriers, the elevated walkways, all of it built by neighbors helping neighbors under the guidance of someone they'd known only as a waitress until yesterday. Mr. Miller, we all worked together. I just had some experience that turned out to be useful. Experience? Frank chuckled. Dorothy and I were talking about that. Nobody learns to organize flood control from reading books. You were military, weren't you? Navy, submarines. Frank nodded slowly. I was Army, Korea. Different war, different service, but I recognize the way you think. The way you see problems and solutions before other people even understand there's a problem. He paused. What I don't understand is how someone with your skills ended up waiting tables in a small town. Claire was quiet for a moment, watching volunteers work to clear debris from the streets with the same cooperative spirit that had made the emergency response successful. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while, Mr. Miller. Sometimes starting over is the only way to figure out who you really are. And did you? Figure out who you are? I think yesterday helped with that. Frank studied her face with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize important moments when they happened. You're staying, aren't you? Not just as emergency coordinator, but really staying, making Millhaven your home. I think I am. Good. Frank turned to leave, then paused. Claire, whatever happened before that made you want to disappear. It doesn't matter now. What matters is what you did yesterday and what you'll do tomorrow. As Frank walked away, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense of belonging somewhere, not just occupying space or performing duties, but being part of a community that valued her contribution. Over the following weeks, Millhaven settled into a new rhythm. The emergency preparedness program that Claire developed became a model for other small communities facing climate-related challenges. Representatives from the State Emergency Management Agency visited regularly, documenting procedures and interviewing residents about their experiences. The program started with basic classes held in the community center every Tuesday evening. Claire taught residents how to read weather patterns, understand flood risks, and prepare emergency kits for their families. But the real innovation was the neighborhood response teams. Groups of residents who knew each other's capabilities, medical needs, and evacuation requirements. David Fletcher proved invaluable as her assistant, bringing professional engineering knowledge to complement her emergency management experience. Together, they conducted detailed assessments of every building in town, identifying structural vulnerabilities and developing specific protection strategies for different flood scenarios. The Youth Emergency Skills Program proved especially popular. Teenagers who had helped with the flood response became instructors for younger children, teaching basic first aid, emergency communication, and disaster preparedness. The program gave young people a sense of purpose and responsibility while building capabilities that would serve the community for decades. Sarah Martinez's bakery became an unofficial headquarters for these sessions, with Claire often finding herself explaining water pressure principles over coffee and pastries. The informal setting made technical information more accessible, and the social aspect helped build the relationships that were essential for effective emergency response. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. Millhaven had discovered something about itself during those desperate hours of flood preparation. The town's residents had learned that they could accomplish remarkable things when they worked together, guided by expertise, but driven by mutual care and concern. 6 months after the flood, Clare stood in the Millhaven Community Center, addressing a room full of emergency management professionals from across the region. The Millhaven model had attracted national attention as an example of how small communities could develop effective disaster preparedness without major federal funding. The key principle, Clare explained to the assembled group, is that emergency preparedness isn't about equipment or procedures. It's about relationships. When people trust each other and understand each other's capabilities, they can improvise solutions that no manual could anticipate. In the audience, she recognized faces from that desperate night 6 months ago. Tom Bradley, now coordinator of Regional Emergency Services. David Fletcher, who had started his own flood control consulting business while maintaining his role as Millhaven's assistant emergency coordinator. Sarah Martinez, who had become the town's volunteer coordinator for disaster preparedness training. But the face that caught her attention was in the back row. Captain Jennifer Walsh, United States Navy, wearing the uniform Clare hadn't put on in 5 years. After the presentation, Captain Walsh approached with the measured stride of someone comfortable with authority but respectful of others' accomplishments. "Ms. Thornton, I'm Captain Walsh from Naval Personnel Command. I was hoping we could speak privately." Clare felt a familiar chill. Official visits from the Navy usually meant complications she thought she'd left behind. "Of course, Captain. There's a conference room we can use." They settled into chairs across from each other, and Captain Walsh placed a folder on the table between them. "Clare, I'm going to be direct. The Navy knows about your work here in Millhaven. Emergency management professionals have been talking about the flood response for months, and eventually someone made the connection between the Clare Thornton, who saved this town, and the Lieutenant Commander Clare Hawthorne, who served with distinction for 15 years. I legally changed my name, Captain. Clare Hawthorne doesn't exist anymore. Actually, that's why I'm here. The investigation into the submarine accident that ended your career has been reopened. New evidence suggests that the equipment failure was caused by manufacturing defects that were covered up by the contractor." Clare felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What kind of evidence?" "Similar failures in 3 other submarines, all using the same pressure system components from the same manufacturer. The company falsified testing data and bribed inspectors to hide design flaws." Captain Walsh opened the folder, revealing technical documents marked with various classification levels. "Clare, you didn't miss anything. The system was defective from the beginning, and the contractor went to great lengths to conceal that fact." The implications hit Clare like a physical blow. 3 crew members had died because of corporate fraud, not her oversight. She'd spent 5 years believing that her inadequate inspection had cost lives, when the truth was that no inspection could have detected the deliberately hidden flaws. Captain Walsh continued. "The Navy would like to offer you full reinstatement. Restoration of rank, back pay, choice of assignment. Additionally, there's interest in your emergency management work. We're developing new programs for disaster response in coastal communities." Clare stared at the documents, seeing vindication for mistakes she'd never made and opportunities she'd stopped dreaming about years ago. "Captain, I appreciate this more than you know, but I need time to think." "Of course, these are significant decisions." Captain Walsh stood to leave, then paused. "Clare, can I ask you something? Do you miss it? The service, I mean." Clare considered the question. "I miss the sense of mission. I miss knowing that my work directly protected people's lives. but I've found something similar here. The emergency management work, the community. In the Navy, I was responsible for equipment and procedures. Here, I'm responsible for people, their safety, their preparedness, their ability to take care of each other. Captain Walsh nodded thoughtfully. For what it's worth, the investigation report describes your post-Navy work as exemplifying the highest traditions of naval service, protecting communities, training others, putting lives before career advancement. That evening, Claire found herself at Murphy's Diner, sitting in the same booth where she'd served coffee to worried customers for 5 years. Janet Murphy had kept her old job open, though everyone understood that Claire's emergency management responsibilities would prevent her from returning to full-time waitressing. "So," Janet said, sliding into the seat across from her. Navy Captain Walsh seemed pretty official. Good news or bad news? Claire had learned that keeping secrets in a small town was nearly impossible, especially when visitors wore military uniforms. Complicated news. The kind of complicated that might take you away from Millhaven. The kind of complicated that offers me everything I thought I wanted 5 years ago. Janet was quiet for a moment, refilling Claire's coffee cup with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades. "Can I ask you something, Claire? Are you happy here?" The question was simpler than it sounded. Happiness wasn't something Claire had considered much during her years of hiding from responsibility. Survival, yes. Purpose, occasionally. But happiness? "I think I am," Claire said slowly. "Or at least I'm learning how to be." "Then the decision's easy, isn't it?" "Is it?" Janet smiled. "Claire, in 5 years of working here, you've never looked as alive as you did during that flood. Not because you were in danger, but because you were using everything you'd learned to protect people. That's not something you can get in every job." The next morning, Claire met Captain Walsh at the marina, where she'd launched the boat that saved the Miller family. The water was calm now, reflecting the morning sky like polished glass, showing no signs of the chaos that had occurred here 6 months earlier. "Captain, I've made my decision. And I'm honored by the Navy's offer, but I'm staying in Millhaven. This is where I'm needed." Captain Walsh didn't seem surprised. "The Navy will be disappointed, but I understand. What you've built here is impressive. Can I ask you something, Captain? How did the Navy really feel about my original investigation findings? Not the official report, but what people actually thought." "Honestly, most of us knew you were thorough and competent. When the accident happened, it didn't fit your track record. But the contractor had powerful connections, and finding a scapegoat was easier than investigating corporate fraud." Claire nodded. "That's what I suspected. It's part of why I left. For what it's worth, that's changing. The new investigations have led to major reforms in how we handle equipment procurement and safety oversight. Maybe some good will come from those deaths after all." Captain Walsh extended her hand. "Thank you for your service, Claire. Both past and present." As the Navy car disappeared down the coast road, Claire found herself alone at the marina where her most important rescue had begun. She pulled out her phone and called David Fletcher. "David, it's Claire. Are you free for a planning meeting?" "What are we planning?" "Expansion. I just turned down a job offer from the Navy, which means I'm committed to making Millhaven the best prepared community on the East Coast." David's laughter carried clearly over the phone. "In that case, I'll bring coffee and the flood maps. We've got work to do." 6 months later, the Millhaven Regional Emergency Training Center opened in a converted warehouse near the marina. The facility included classroom space, hands-on training areas, and simulation equipment that allowed communities to practice emergency response in controlled conditions. Claire found herself teaching courses she never could have imagined during her submarine years. community leadership in crisis, resource management for small towns, and building trust networks for emergency response. The center attracted students from across the region, small town mayors, volunteer fire chiefs, community organizers, and residents who wanted to make their neighborhoods more resilient. But Claire's favorite program remained the Youth Emergency Skills Training, where teenagers learned that being prepared didn't mean being afraid, it meant being capable. 2 years after the flood, Claire stood on the dock at Millhaven Marina, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The marina had become a symbol of the town's resilience, rebuilt after the flood, with improvements that made it both more beautiful and more functional. A small boat was approaching from the direction of the river, the morning mail boat that connected Millhaven to the offshore islands. But this morning, it carried more than mail. Frank and Dorothy Miller climbed carefully onto the dock, followed by a young woman Claire didn't recognize. The newcomer moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to physical challenges, and Claire noticed the telltale signs of recent military discharge. Short haircut, alert posture, that particular way of scanning surroundings that marked former service members. "Claire," Frank called out, "we've brought someone to meet you. This is Lieutenant Sarah Kim, recently discharged from the Coast Guard. She's looking for a place to start over." Claire studied the young woman's face, seeing something familiar in her expression. The mixture of uncertainty and determination that marked someone trying to rebuild their life after leaving military service. "What kind of work are you looking for, Sarah?" "I'm not sure," Sarah replied honestly. "I was a rescue swimmer for 8 years. I'm good in the water, good in emergencies, but I don't know how civilian skills translate." Claire smiled, remembering her own confusion when she'd first arrived in Millhaven. "Emergency skills always translate. The question is finding the right application." She gestured toward the training center visible from the marina. "We're expanding our water rescue training program. We need someone with Coast Guard experience to develop curriculum and lead exercises." "You'd hire someone you just met?" "I'd give you a chance to prove what you can do. That's all anyone really needs." As they walked toward the training center, Sarah asked the question that Claire had been expecting. "What's your background?" "You don't move like a civilian." 15 years Navy submarines. 5 years running from that experience. 2 years learning that experience never really goes away. It just finds new ways to be useful. Sarah stopped walking. "You're the Claire Thornton? The one who developed the Millhaven model?" "I'm the waitress who learned that small towns need the same skills that keep submarines safe: attention to detail, preparation for the unexpected, and people who look out for each other." That afternoon, Claire found herself training her probable replacement in many of the skills she'd developed over the past 2 years. Sarah Kim proved to be a quick learner with natural teaching abilities and an intuitive understanding of emergency psychology. "Claire," Sarah said as they finished setting up equipment for a rescue training exercise, "can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever regret leaving the Navy?" Claire considered the question while watching volunteers from 3 different communities practice water rescue techniques in the marina. The program had grown beyond Millhaven to include neighboring towns, creating a network of trained responders who could support each other during emergencies. "I regret the circumstances that made me feel like I had to leave," she said finally, "but I don't regret the life I built afterward." "Even though you could have had higher rank, better pay, more recognition?" "Sarah, look around. This training center exists because a community trusted someone they knew as a waitress to keep them safe during a flood. These volunteers will go home and teach their families what they learned here. When the next emergency comes, dozens of communities will be better prepared because of work that started with one bad storm in one small town." Sarah nodded slowly. "That's a different kind of service." "It's the same service. just measured differently. In the military, success is about completing missions and following orders. In communities, success is about building capabilities that belong to everyone. As the training session concluded, Claire realized that she'd found something she'd never expected when she first arrived in Millhaven: the ability to pass on what she'd learned. Not just technical skills, but the harder lessons about resilience, leadership, and the importance of using experience to protect others. That evening, Claire sat in her apartment above the training center, writing her weekly report to the State Emergency Management Agency. The routine had become comforting, documenting what worked, what needed improvement, what lessons could be shared with other communities. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Fletcher, who was consulting with a town in North Carolina facing similar flood risks. Successfully implemented modified Millhaven drainage system. Zero property damage during yesterday's storm. Small towns taking care of themselves, one preparedness program at a time. Claire smiled and typed back, "That's what it's all about. Safe travels." Outside her window, Millhaven settled into its evening routine. Lights came on in houses where families gathered for dinner. The marina grew quiet as the day's boat traffic diminished. The training center stood ready for tomorrow's programs, equipped with simulators and classroom materials that would help other communities build their own resilience. Claire Thornton had spent 5 years learning to be invisible, trying to disappear from responsibilities that felt too heavy to bear. But she'd discovered that some kinds of knowledge demanded to be used, that expertise was most valuable when it was shared, and that the best way to honor past mistakes was to prevent future ones. The submarine service had taught her about pressure, systems, and emergency procedures. Millhaven had taught her about community, trust, and the kind of leadership that built capacity in others rather than dependence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: storm systems to monitor, volunteers to train, communities to visit, young veterans to mentor in the art of translating military skills to civilian service. But tonight, Claire felt something she'd never expected to experience again: the deep satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that endured, and a place that was truly home. The water beneath the surface ran deep and steady, carrying the accumulated strength of all who had learned to navigate by its currents. And Claire Thornton, former submarine engineer and current guardian of community resilience, slept peacefully, knowing that tomorrow she would continue building the kind of safety that belonged to everyone. In the distance, Mill Creek ran clear and controlled through channels designed by neighbors working together, ready to handle whatever storms might come. It was a fitting metaphor for a life rebuilt on the principles of preparation, community, and the understanding that the most important victories were often the quiet ones that prevented disasters before they began. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.